Today I have Lydia Wylie-Kellermann with me. And Lydia, you are the editor of Geese magazine. Do you say it Geese or G's? Like, is it kind of
G's.
a
Yep.
GIF
G's
kind of
magazine.
situation?
Yep. It is.
With that said, you are the editor of G's, and you've also written a number, or at least one other book, The Sandbox Revolution. And you're out of Detroit, and you're currently writing a new book that we're going to chat about, which I'm really excited for. At the timing of recording this, it's a little ways out from when it will release, but yeah, as of right now, the title is "This Sweet Earth: Walking with Our Children in an Age of Climate Collapse." I'm really excited to chat a little bit more about the book. But with all of that said, with all the things I've talked a little bit about you, who is Lydia Wylie-Kellermann to Lydia Wylie-Kellermann?
Mm, it's such a good question. Maybe thinking about it in two ways of both sort of thinking about what it is that I love and the ways that I've been formed. Um, so I love putting words on paper and I
Mm,
love gathering stories. I love lighting Advent candles and I love snow. And I love the power of community. I love putting my body in the streets. Um, I love the juicy conversations around theology. Um, I love power of the ancestors. And I think maybe to say a bit about too, sort of some of the strands that formed me. I was raised in Detroit, so I feel very formed by the city, by
mm-hmm.
the history and the injustice that are built into the streets, but also the incredible resistance, particularly led by Black women in the city, and by the urban agriculture movement in Detroit, and the ways that folks are so often asking questions around what does it mean to be a post-industrial city and how do we create community and think about the ways that we can support one another when the systems crumble. I was raised by parents who are writers and theologians and activists. So much of my formation happened on the streets and in the living rooms of Catholic workers, and breaking bread there. And more, I find myself being formed and changed by my kids. I've got two
Mm,
kids who are 10 and 7 now, and who they are and the questions they ask and how they see the world. It's just constantly shifting who I am and how I engage in life and yeah, who I want to be. So those are a few pieces of
yeah.
yeah, what has gone into me.
I love that. You do definitely have like a different background than myself, and certainly I would imagine a lot of my listeners, a lot of us grew up in the evangelical world, and so the fact that you were in that world of kind of more academic folks and people who are out in the streets, fighting for justice, not exactly the upbringing that a lot of us had, but I'm really, it's so cool to watch people because so much of my experience and the people that I'm surrounded by, their childhood and where they're at now is so drastically different. What they believed when they were a kid
Yeah.
versus what they believe now is so much different. And to see people who this is how they were raised and that matters to them to this day, that is a really fascinating trajectory that I'm not very familiar with, and I would imagine a lot of my listeners aren't
Yeah.
either. So to see people that were formed by the kind of world that I'm now in, and to see them still
Mhm.
really, involved in that way is just really incredible. To know that that justice work has a long-lasting
Yeah.
legacy, and that also it really forms and shapes people in the way that I think a lot of evangelicals would hope that that their world forms and shapes people.
Yeah. It is such a gift. I mean, I feel that in sort of the work that I think about in churches, but not having I mean, sort of seeing the toxicness that happens in theology and particularly in white Christianity and colonialism and feeling all of that and knowing resistance, but not feeling that those sort of toxic streams in my body, like to have just been raised with like a faith that was so inseparable from
Hmm.
justice and liberation. Like I feel so much gratitude for that, and it really is really informing and hopeful of like how I want to raise my kids, like what it
Right.
meant to be told the truth about injustice and to be part of those struggles was such a gift as a child.
Totally. Yeah, I often think about the fact that so many of us who did grow up really conservative, really evangelical, have now gone to where we're at now, where a lot of us are anti-capitalist. A lot of folks end up
Hmm.
becoming or realizing that they're queer and all of
Yeah,
that. And so there's so much of a change that happens. And the funny thing is, so many of us grew up believing that the older we get, the more conservative we're going to get, and that has actually just been the opposite of my experience, and I would imagine the
yeah,
experience for a lot of other people. And one of the things that I do know a few folks that were raised in kind of a more liberal vein like yourself. And
hmm,
what's interesting is very few of those people actually do end up leaving that world and kind of change it around, and they all of a sudden become conservative. Very few of those people I know. It does seem like
yeah,
there's tends to be more of this natural trajectory of, if you were raised conservative, there's a good likelihood that you very well might end up becoming very liberal. But if you grew up really liberal, there's very good, it seems to be, in my experience, more
yeah,
likely that you remain that. And so
hmm,
it's really interesting to me in terms of like thinking around parenting around that, especially.
hmm,
Um,
hmm,
but maybe we can chat about that in a little bit. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the book now, but maybe you have some ideas around like kind of that trajectory that happens among people based on the way that they
yeah,
were parented and where they're at now as adults. But anyway, with
hmm,
that said, let's talk about the book. Obviously, this book is a lot of memoir where you're talking quite a bit about your own experience of being parented and also parenting. Can you talk?
hmm,
But I would imagine there is some level of research that goes on into a book like this. With obviously this book really centering around climate change. I would imagine there's some things that you're having to learn about when it comes to climate change, or all the other kind of more factual pieces, if you will, that go into writing
hmm.
a book like this. Was there anything that came up in the research for the book that you were unsure about or unfamiliar with before? Maybe there was some sort of fact about climate change, or maybe there was something else.
Mm,
Maybe there was some theology that you ended up digging into a little bit more that you
hmm,
learned from writing this book. But yeah, anything that came up from the research from this book that you didn't know before.
hmm. This is a slightly different answer to that question, just in terms of what surprised me. Like, I think I came to this book knowing how much grief and anxiety and rage that I was sort of carrying in my body, fear that I had for kids. That sort of
Hmm.
feels like the starting point. And I feel like it had been a while of just sort of watching climate science come out and just doomsday scrolling, just sort of like how bad is this and what does it mean for my children and generations to come after that. And so I sort of anticipated in the writing that I would feel most of that, feel a lot of despair. And
Mm.
instead, I think what surprised me was stumbling on how much hope I actually
Mm.
found in the writing, and how much joy there was. Um, because realizing that sort of what the things that I want to teach my kids are in like preparation for climate catastrophe that's in front of us are actually the things that I would want them to know, even if there was no climate change. Like, even if this wasn't the moment that we were in, like, I so often hear people say, like, I feel so bad for this next generation because they won't have what I had.
Mm.
And instead, as I write, I'm like, I don't actually want them to have what we had. Like, what I want them to know how to do is like do work with their hands. And I want them to be able to know how to grow food. And I want them to be able to find those places of deep joy and to connect with the earth and understand themselves as creatures and to know what it's like to depend and rely on community and to be able to fight like hell and create what's possible and be able to be with death. Like, all of those things are what I would want for my kids anyway. And so being able to sort of articulate that was actually just sort of surprised in me how much hope and joy there was in the midst of that.
Hmm. Absolutely. I feel the same way. Knowing that we're in the midst of this rise of homophobia and transphobia and white supremacy and obviously climate change and a million other things, or
Yeah.
literally going on right now. In the
Right.
midst of all of that, I don't know why, but ever since I left evangelicalism and have gotten myself more rooted in more of these justice type of theological traditions and Christian traditions, I just have become even more hopeful. So it
Mhm.
is really interesting how that is the case in the midst of so much tragedy, so much oppression.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, the
One
power
of
of community is such a gift.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things you talk about early on in the book is the grief you experience when it comes to obviously the reality of climate change. What are some of the ways that you navigate this grief since there's very little any one of us can just do to combat climate change, right? Like there's only so much you and I and all the other individuals in the world really can do
Mm,
to combat and fight this very global thing happening. Yeah, how do you navigate that grief
mm,
as you experience climate change?
mm. Well, for me personally, I feel like writing is a huge way that I
Mm,
process my heart. I think a big piece of it has been figuring out ways to slow down, and be able to pay attention to it and to touch it and to release it from our bodies, rather than letting it get stuck. And I think doing that with my kids is such a gift too, and sort of just the gift of letting our kids see our hearts break, which I think is a tendency we have around kids to not let that show. And I think a lot about the land, and our
mm,
connection to land and the ways in which like, there's nothing too big or hard that the land can't hold. And so, how can we give our grief to the land? How can we put our hands on the stones or sob in the lakes, and release it and let that be held
mm,
there, um and no, the land has been holding grief for a very long time,
mm,
um and I also think being part of that somehow, like being part of holding what the land is holding, um being able to articulate that, and I do think community is a huge part of that. Like for me, I think the best way to release grief in my body is in the streets.
mm,
Um, I think uh, I think especially for those of us who are raised in sort of white churches, like we don't really have an embodied faith that has been offered to us. With like
right.
church is very rarely an embodied experience. So like for me, where I get into my body is getting into the streets. And
Mm,
so being able to take whatever grief and rage and joining in community in the streets is how it's released.
mm,
Um and I think too, what I love about that space is the way in which suddenly everything is intersectional. It's like you can't get into the streets with community with and not see the ways that climate justice is integral to racial justice and economic justice and peacemaking, and sort of all of those pieces get so intertwined, and that grief and that rage and that hope is all the same struggle. Um, and so for me, that is a place that is just such a huge gift and release
mm-hmm,
for holding our grief.
mm-hmm. I want to touch around the parenting piece, obviously, because that's such a important part of this book. One of the things that I've learned over the last couple years is the development of the nuclear family and how it's actually a pretty recent invention in human history.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
often think of, just because of the way that we think about history, is whatever is happening now, it's always been like that, right? But that's not the case, certainly. And the nuclear family is one of those things. It hasn't
Yeah.
been that families are just like a mom, a dad, and 2.5 kids in their white picket fence. Like that is
Right.
such a
Yes.
recent development in human history, and that was something
Mhm.
that really really surprised me when I first learned that. I just assumed that
Mhm.
that's always how families have been, but it's not at all. Um,
Mhm.
and one of the things that I find really interesting around this concept of the nuclear family is, even though a lot of conservative kind of groups really rally around this idea of the nuclear family, I find it to be super isolating for parents to have to to have to essentially raise their kids, and it's just them that raise them. I find that such a really odd and isolating way of parenting. So can you talk a
Yes.
little bit about this concept of the nuclear family as you raise your own children, and
Mm,
why it adds this pressure, or even maybe compounds that pressure with the fact that we also have literally we're going through a climate crisis.
yeah.
It seems like parenting now is just under so much pressure, not only because of the nuclear family, but also because we literally are in climate catastrophe. So, can you talk a little bit about
Mhm.
that nuclear family concept, and then also how it maybe how you navigate that through all the other pressures of parenting?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I have the gift of being part of a wonderfully queer family. So my partner and I have our two kids, and think I grew up as part of the Catholic worker community in Detroit. So we had about 15 families that all chose to live on the same block together, and all had kids. So there were about 30 kids of us that grew up together on this block who were sharing in resistance work and hospitality, and just growing up together. And so I think partly because of that, I've had such a deep love and appreciation of intergenerational community and
Mm,
the importance of elders and the gifts that I received from so many of those adults in my life. Um, and so, and also, my mom died when I was 19, and I think that also was a moment for me of realizing, like, I needed mothers. I needed to claim a wider family.
mm,
Um, and and so I did that. Like I just claimed these women that I needed. And so now like my kids have so many grandmothers who
mm,
have just been claimed and claimed them. And my kids are so delighted to just enlarge a family as much as it is. Like they're ready to claim cousins and siblings and grandparents, and sort of those bloodlines of a nuclear family are just not that important. And our their sperm donor is a really good friend of ours who is an amazing human being in their lives. And so just
mm,
being able to grow and expand that, and then to see the gifts that that is for my children, like, to be loved by so many grown-ups, and, like, and I agree, it's like, thank God that I don't have to do this alone, like, I can't teach them all there is to know, like, that's way too much pressure, and too hard, and exhausting, um, but, like, growing up in the neighborhood that we've been in, um, there are so many folks who know so many skills, so they're learning to be beekeepers by one of our neighborhoods, and like they're harvesting honey, and there are other adults on the block who speak Spanish, and there are other folks that make tamales, and other folks that can do plumbing, and there's people who play the tuba, and there's folks who give them piano lessons, and folks who make medicinal medicines. Like there's the more community that we can build, and the more skills that we have, and the more we can just shower that on our kids, is
mm-hmm,
just like, who wants a nuclear family? Like it's not sustainable. And there's so many gifts to expanding that our kids need, and then we're gonna need, and the ways that elders need us.
mm-hmm,
Um, like, I think so much of a nuclear family depends on creating these systems of individualism, of saying, like, all right, we're going to put older folks in nursing homes, and we're going to kind of separate ourselves from one another. And one of the things that climate change, I think, exposes is the way that these systems are going to crumble. And then individualism doesn't work anymore. And
mm-hmm.
so the chances that we have to just claim family in such a larger way becomes practice for what it means when these systems really do crumble, that we know one another's needs and one another's names and what brings joy and what skills we have is just a tremendous gift.
Hmm. I went to an evangelical college and I was a youth ministry major. And I still remember one of the things that they often talked about in my youth ministry classes was uh, I'm sure there's some data around this, and this is why they were probably bringing it up, but there was something around especially for a teenager, to have a non-parent adult in their life that loves them and cares for them is like one of the one of the best predictors of like future like success for a child, like going on to getting a college degree,
Yeah.
all these other kind of like milestone marker things for a person. And one of the things, like, now looking back on that, it's like here's this evangelical college like promoting this idea of like other adults being in a child's life, and I'm like, but you're also like the same people that are trying to hold on to this like nuclear family concept. So I'm like, one of
Right.
these things has got to give, right? And so I
Yeah.
just find that really funny that they were like telling us about how important it was for other adults to be in child's life, and yet at the same time it is they're promoting this concept that's doing quite literally
Yeah.
the opposite. It's working against that. So
Mhm.
anyway, I don't know if you have thoughts around that, but I always find that really funny
No,
now,
it
knowing
makes
what I
sense
know
to
now about the
me.
nuclear family.
Yeah. Yeah. That research makes sense to me.
Absolutely. So it has been quite some time since human parents in particular, have parented children through the changing of a climate. I think probably
Mm.
the Ice Age was the last time that's happened. So it's been a few years since that's happened. And certainly this is the first time in human history that we've had to parent children through the changing of the climate due to our own species. That's never happened before,
Mhm.
so that's a first.
Mhm.
Uh, One of the things that I find really interesting is sometimes you hear people propose that humans should just simply stop having children altogether. But
Mhm.
oftentimes, you hear like that argument being a part of ecofascism. And so this is a concept that I am kind of newly familiar with, is this idea of ecofascism. Can you talk a little? I'm sure like ecofascism in some degree, when you're writing a book about parenting children through climate change, I'm sure ecofascism is something that like comes up, or something you at least have to think about. Can you talk a little bit about what that ecofascism is, and why simply not having children is not the solution to climate change?
Mm. I don't know if I could speak to the ecofascism, but I could certainly speak to that feeling. I mean, I know so many folks who are saying I can't have children because of climate change. Like that is a very, very real question that folks are carrying right now. And there's a lot of grief in there. Like there are folks
Mm,
who are like, I know that I always wanted to be a parent, and how could I possibly bring them into this world? And it's
mm,
another like deep level of grief that people are carrying. Um, and I really honor that question. And I think there's a lot of ways to navigate it. And I think people need to make that decision for themselves. And I'm also grateful that there's so many ways that all of us can love on kids, whether we have kids of our own or not. I think for me, one of the conversations that was really helpful, we were doing a issue for G's on climate justice and did an interview with Joanna Macy, who was just amazing to talk to. You know, she's in her 90s and she's been doing ecological work for
wow.
so long. And this was one of the questions that we asked her was how, there's so many young folks who are like, I can't have kids. What does that mean in this moment? And she really thought about it, and she said, "I'm so grateful for folks who are choosing to bring kids into this world in this moment because we're gonna need them.
Mm,
Because they're not gonna come with the same addictions that so many of us have to, um, capitalism and, uh, independence and, white supremacy, like, all of these systems and cultures that are changing and shifting, they're gonna bring with them something different. They're gonna help guide us through, hopefully, what is a shift from death-dealing systems to life-giving, system. So that was really helpful for me. And that is my experience of walking with these kids. It's just this incredible gift of the ways that they see the world in a way that I never did.
Mhm.
They are not disconnected from creatures and the earth, and they don't have to unlearn and relearn what so many of us have been doing. That there is this gift that young folks are going to bring, and I think we see that in movements right now. Like, just young folks are amazing and leading the way. Um, so I find it I like really am grateful that to have made the choice to bring kids into this world, and I think there's amazing work to be done there, and I really honor the wrestling of that question and knowing that
Mhm.
folks are needing to make a decision not to, because it is hard to imagine, um, and just knowing that we as humans are take up way too much space and resources on this planet, and that's real.
Mhm. Is that part of the decision-making process that you've heard from people that are navigating this question about whether or not they should have children at this time in human history? Is it around like tr thinking that they may be creating another generation that's going to consume more and destroy this earth more, or is it more so of this grief or this this fear that they're going to bring in children into a world that may be crumbling and it's a it's a you don't want to just bring in children knowing full well that who knows if they're going to survive quite literally because
Right.
of climate change. Or is it both of those things? Like what are some of the kind of core questions or fears that you hear from people about bringing children into the world in the midst of climate change?
I think it's exactly both of those pieces. It's both sort of, yeah, the space that we take up and the resources we take, and just knowing that the human population is growing so fast, and not sustainable. And yeah, we don't know if our kids are going to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a terrifying, terrifying thought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are ways that you think children should get involved in fighting climate change? Obviously, you've got your own two children. What are maybe ways that you encourage them to get involved in fighting climate change? Or, and maybe there are some other creative ways that you've seen or heard of or been a part of
Mhm.
in getting children involved in this.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there are lots of things, pieces of work that we can do as parents that kind of shift their understanding towards seeing and understanding climate change, and feeling really connected to the earth. And then out of that, I think kids just have that desire to do something. And I certainly see that in my own kids. And, we've talked a lot about resistance in the streets, which I think is sort of one piece of that work. My 10-year-old and I have every night been reading Naomi Klein's book for young folks on
Mm-hmm.
how to change everything, which is just it's such a great book at both sort of rooting in climate justice, but then being so hopeful about the work that kids are doing all over the world and the real shifts that they're making. And so the more that we can kind of name and claim the ways that kids have power, and is crucial. And they can't know they have power unless we tell them the truth. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that is also like a really key piece of this, is that there's such a desire to shield kids from it and to let kids be kids and to like not tell them what's going on. And so I think it actually takes a lot of courage for those of us who are in relationship with kids to actually tell them the truth,
Mm-hmm.
about sort of how serious things are, and figure out the words to stumble through that and to know that we don't have the answers. Um, but yeah, I mean, for a long time, I think we always let our kids make their own signs when we go to protests, and they're always wild and wonderful. And my youngest, I think, one of his earliest climate marches, I think, it might have been, there was like a walkout around the whole globe years ago, So he skipped preschool, but he made this giant sign that said, "I love eggs," and it's like that was totally what he loved and still loves. I don't know, he's had a weird love for eggs, but like just
Are
honoring
are you
that
one of those
voice.
families that have chickens in the backyard?
Yes, yes,
Of
yes, we
course.
are.
Okay then.
Yeah, yeah,
Hence
yeah.
why a preschooler would love eggs.
Yeah, yeah. He won't let us eat them because they're so beautiful.
Oh,
So
it's not even it's not like he just loved the taste of eggs. It's that he
no,
just
it
liked
is
the look of
like
them.
holding them in your hands, like they're
Oh, I love
just
that.
so beautiful,
That's so precious.
So yeah, so we've got a wall full of all the signs that they've made over the years, and um, my oldest is really getting serious about understanding the role of boycotts, and particularly right now in terms of what's happening in Gaza, like he's starting to just like call Congress folks and bring his own voice and anger and grief into the conversation, and just like watching their courage and their articulation of things, and just sort of fanning that whenever we see it happen, is amazing to watch and to sort of encourage them along that.
Hmm. There's something to be said about empowering children to have a voice and to know that they have a voice when it comes to these things. I was a part of a church community in Minneapolis called Solomon's Porch, and one of the things that we were really we really encouraged was children to be very involved in our
Mhm.
worship on Sundays. And so whether it was they were up front, or I guess it wasn't really up front because we were all kind of in and around in a circle. So whether they were in the middle singing along, or sometimes they would introduce communion. So instead of having like a clergy person introduce communion, the kids would do that.
Wow.
Or whether they were, bringing in the elements for communion, or even we would have these sermon discussions, and sometimes kids had things they wanted to say about what was going on in these Bible stories.
Mhm.
But for them to know that their voice is valued just like an adult's, there's something really powerful for a child, and especially when it comes to
Yeah.
these really important issues like climate change, for those kids to know they have something to contribute to what is happening
Mhm.
when it comes to fighting climate change has got to be just like developmentally a very important thing for them, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's such a resistance in our culture to just sort of saying like kids matter and they should take up space and bring whatever messy, awkward, uh, developmental moment that they're in into this space, and to be trusted and have their voice honored is huge.
Hmm. We've already mentioned capitalism a few times, and I think it's at least worth to really kind of flesh that part out a little bit more. Uh, I think it's very obvious that there's a relationship between climate change and capitalism. I think a lot of people in the climate change world, to some degree, recognize that as well. Can you talk a little,
Mhm.
and knowing G's and everything, I would imagine you've had quite a bit of thoughts around this. So, can you talk a little bit about that relationship between capitalism and climate change?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard not to see that capitalism is what fuels climate change. The sort of need for constant production and constant profit, and it's a system that so easily doesn't honor human beings, and if we can't honor human beings, then we're definitely not going to honor the earth and the resources, and we need a system that understands community and understands the sacredness of life. And capitalism is never going to do that.
Mm,
And so again, it's sort of that it's all interconnected. That to if there's gonna be a new way of living that, I mean, we can't stop climate change, but I think that there are ways that we still can make pretty fundamental radical shifts that bring us into a different kind of relationship with the earth. But part of that has to be fully dismantling capitalism and letting that system crumble around us. And um, I think when I think about it in terms of my own kids and my neighborhood, what that has looked like is figuring out how to build as local economies as possible, like just getting really, really local. There was a time I think about it, we've got lots and lots of fruit trees in our yard, and our cherry tree was abundant, and a neighbor stopped over and was like, "Can we pick cherries?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course." And they brought over a bag and they filled it up, and then they handed me $5. And then that night, their kid came over and said, "Oh, my family made pupusa dinners. Do you want some?" And I said, "Oh, sure." And like handed them back that same $5 bill and was like, "Oh, this is how money could work." Like,
Mhm.
what does it mean to keep things as local as possible? And in our neighborhood, like, we just started every Wednesday afternoon a tiny farmers market where anybody who had anything to sell could bring it. And we would bring whatever vegetables and fruit we had, and eggs, and um other neighbors brought their queso over, and another neighbor always had honey, and somebody else was making soap. And we would just sit around and have community for a couple hours and chat, and then all exchange things. And what does it mean to hire a plumber from your neighborhood, and to like to stop relying on systems of capitalism? And I think that's possible. Like, I really think that we can do that, but like the first step has to be getting to know our neighbors. Like, if we don't know
Mhm.
who we're living around and living with and what they do, then we can't. We're stuck in that sort of same nuclear family, dependent on the systems for everything. And so they don't want us to get to know one another, because if we do, we could really change everything.
Mhm. Mhm. I I talked to a person named Lenny Duncan about a year or so ago, and Lenny made this unbelievable point that I've never considered before, but I thought it was great. And I forget exactly the conversation we were having, but Lenny said something along the lines of, if we actually believed and lived out Jesus's commandment to love our neighbors, like if we did that among, like we actually loved our geographic neighbors, the people that live
Mhm.
right next to us, if we actually did that, we wouldn't need cops anymore,
Yeah.
because we would actually care for the moments
Yeah.
where typically we just say, all right, this person that doesn't live in our neighborhood, come and deal with this, right? But if we
Yeah.
actually loved our neighbors, we would love them to make sure that they're getting the needs met, and that they don't that they we wouldn't be reliant on somebody
Right.
that isn't from the neighborhood coming in and potentially escalating things, right?
Yeah.
And I think
Exactly.
that's similarly with what you're describing with your neighbors. Of if we
Mhm.
actually loved our neighbors, or like our geographic neighbors, then we wouldn't need capitalism anymore, because
Right.
we know that there's this abundance of things that we love and enjoy and need in the world. And
Mhm.
there's so many people who love sharing that with other people, right? Like whether it's your cherry tree or somebody making something from cherries, or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Like everybody has their own gifts that they love to share. And if we actually loved our neighbors, then we would be
Mhm.
sharing with one another in that way all the time, and we would become less reliant on capitalism. And so, anyway, those are some of the thoughts that were running around in my mind when you were talking about this.
Yeah.
This actual, like, if we actually took Jesus seriously by loving our neighbors, the people who actually live next door to us.
Yeah. And what does it mean to do that and practice that right now? Like, I think about 10 years ago, we didn't know most of our neighbors, some of them, and we ended up getting, that was when we first started getting chickens. We got baby chicks, and suddenly, like, there were 2 kids in our backyard that always wanted to be there. And then the next day there were 5 kids, and then there were 10 kids, and then their parents were coming, right? And suddenly we knew one another's names. And then within a year, we were having block parties, and we were doing tutoring, and just sort of slowly expanded, and we got to know one another. And then when COVID hit, we were ready in some ways, right? Like, we started gathering every day outside at 5 o'clock, and distanced, and we celebrated birthdays, and kids learned to ride bikes while we were all out together. And we knew who the elders were and who were immune compromised, and we could check in on one another. And we knew who was undocumented, and we could redistribute stimulus checks, like all of those things. Like, we were ready for a crisis because we had started preparing by getting to know one another.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing, we had a few years ago, massive flood in Detroit that like flooded the entire freeway around us. And basements flooded and, cell systems were out, and it was like the whole freeway was just flooded for days and days. And it was the same sort of thing. Was like we ended up spending so much time outside with our community and with our neighbors, and sort of in some ways turned it into a festival in the midst of knowing sort of how terrifying that moment was. But all we can do is prepare for that. And it's really hard to prepare for it when crisis is here. So, how are those like simple things of literally just like introducing ourselves to our neighbors become part of preparing for the crises that are to come?
Hmm. I mean, you're already kind of answering my next question, which was how do we raise anti-capitalist kids? But it really
Hmm.
sounds like building that community and sharing with kids. This is how we build community. That seems to be maybe a core answer to that question of how we raise anti-capitalist kids. But maybe you have other thoughts around that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think it also just sort of truth telling and modeling. Um, how do we spend money? What does it mean to be transparent about what our family budget is and how we spend money? And how do we? I think a big piece of it too is like how are we accountable to our kids? So like there are so many times where my kids will call on us to do something and I don't want to do it. Whether it's like like again, I said Isaac was into boycotting, and like that's really serious right now for him. Or there was a while where he was like, I do not want a car. Like we can't have a car. And we lived in, we were in Detroit, which is the car capital of the world. Like there's very little public transportation. And it's like we started biking to school every day. And it was like, 8 miles that we were doing every day. But like that was his ask and he was clear about it. And so sometimes I think there are times where it's like it's actually really hard for us adults to do that and kids know. And if we can actually honor them and listen to them again and let that change us,
Mm,
I think that ends up translating into what their values will be down the road.
hmm. One of the other thoughts I have around that, specifically as it relates to capitalism and climate change, is we often see all of these green eco products now in the world, and I think to some degree that's good. I'm glad that we're making that we're making that kind of change, but at the same time, it still is feeding into capitalism, right?
Mhm.
And one of the things that I often think about is good as it is to have these eco products and green products or whatever. At the end of the day, we will never be able to actually fight climate change if we don't reorient our relationship with the planet.
Mhm.
And so one of the sort of like one of the questions I have around that then is how you encourage your children and other children to actually reorient their
Yeah.
relationship to the planet. Obviously, not only fighting climate change, but also my guess is when we reorient our relationship to the planet, we're also going to be fighting capitalism as well. But anyway, I'm curious, like
Yeah.
ways that you encourage children to reorient their relationship with the earth.
Yeah. It's a great question. Um I talk about a quote in the book from Baba Diem that is, "You can't save a place you don't love. You can't love a place you don't know, and you can't know a place you haven't learned."
Mm,
Um, and so, to me, in some ways, it feels like the most basic work we can do is help our children know the place that they live, and the way that falling in love with the land and the roots where they are ends up translating down the road into what it means to fight for it. And so I think a lot of that is like watershed literacy and
mm,
what are the wild edible plants that you can eat in your neighborhood and what are the names of the birds that show up at your bird feeder. I mean, I think there's so much. I talk about the dictionary and how every year the children's dictionary is changing its words and the words that are coming out of the dictionary are all earth words, right? Like there
mm,
needs to be space for email and Zoom, and what comes out is willow and acorn and cardinal, and those words are no longer important for our children
mm,
to learn. And what's the cost of that? It's like millions of birds have disappeared in the last few years. Um, but if we don't even know what they're called, we're not going to notice when they're gone.
Mm,
And
mhm.
so that act of naming and remembering and learning becomes part of the resistance. And yeah, I mean, just spending that intimacy time with the earth, like I see it translate into my kids. One of the most sort of shocking moments to me with my older kid, there was a moment where he like came out of the bathroom and he was on his way back to Legos and he just like called out to me and he was like, "Mommy, if you're there when I die, I want you to drag my body into the woods so that creatures can eat it because I don't want my body to go to waste." And I'm just like, and then he's like back to playing, but like there's this deep understanding in him that like our bodies belong to this earth and like the ways that we can have a good death and the ways that we can continue to
That kid loves
nourish.
Ash Wednesday.
Right, no kidding. Maybe he has
That
all
kid
sorts of
cannot
plans.
wait to go back to dust.
Yeah, exactly. Um, but yeah, I mean, just amazing, and there's so much work for us to do to realize and remember that, like, we're just creatures, like, we're just beautiful creatures on this planet, like, we belong to the planet, and the ways that all of that is also part of resisting white supremacy, which has
Right.
so disconnected us from land and has taught us this sense of, the land belongs to us, and we have to topple all of that over.
Right. God, I'm still can't get over the fact that this kid's Christmas is Ash Wednesday. Like,
Yeah.
imagine like that being like your new year of the church calendar is
Yeah.
is
Whew.
Ash Wednesday. I don't know. I've spent a lot of time with kids in my church community, and I used to substitute teach, so I got to hang out with a lot of kids. But over the last few years, I haven't been able to be with kids as much, partly because of the pandemic and lots of other reasons.
Mhm.
But I could be wrong. But my guess is, especially when I was very regularly interacting with kids to this day, and was the case when I was a kid. I'm sure it was the case when you were a kid. But kids absolutely love animals. Like
Mhm.
I remember wanting to be a monkey so bad when I was 4 years old. And so
Mhm.
you talking about our connection to the land and everything, like there does seem to be this like there seems to be this innate nature to children to like want to connect to the land, to the other creatures on the land. And so again, like it seems like a no-brainer then that we would just
Mhm.
like encourage children to get to know their own the ecosystems in which they live. I think that
Mhm.
seems to be like a no-brainer. But as we
Yeah.
get older, it seems like we disconnect ourselves from
Mhm.
that natural inclination to connect
Mhm.
with our ecosystems and with animals and with other things
Mhm.
on the earth. So anyway, maybe you have thoughts around that, but there does seem to be this innate
Yeah.
desire to want to get to know the other
Yeah.
creatures in the world when you're a kid.
And I think that's so tied to, like, capitalism too, right? Like, we have to be able to slow down and just be outside and watch creatures in order to have that intimacy, but, like, when there's this,
Right.
like, produce, 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 like, it stops that, and so I think part of too the work of parenting is, like, how to give yourself into, like, slowing down and not letting the next thing pull you away. Like, I just in the last couple months was with my 7-year-old and we saw a little turtle digging a hole. Like, I think this turtle is laying eggs. And we sat there for 2.5 hours before we saw this turtle lay eggs. But we did. Like, we watched this turtle lay 6 eggs. Like, it meant giving in and, like, letting things go and having a different understanding of time to be able to say, like, "Yeah, it is important enough to sit outside in the cold for 2.5 hours and watch this happen."
Yeah, there's nothing more entertaining than just watching animals be animals. Way better than any Netflix show or
Mhm.
movie, right?
Yeah.
One of the other ideas, kind of going back to that nuclear family question, but I think it ties into a lot of this as well, is I would imagine there are quite a few of my listeners that aren't themselves parents and maybe have no desire to eventually becoming a parent. And for those people in particular, like what would you encourage to that person about raising children? Because as we mentioned before with like this whole nuclear family question, just because you may not actually parent your own children doesn't necessarily mean that you won't help raise children. So I'm
Right.
curious what your thoughts are around for the person that might be listening that isn't interested in having children or currently doesn't have children. What are ways that they can still help raise children to be anti-capitalist and to fight
Mhm.
climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same work. I think there's not very many of these practices that feel different as a parent versus just somebody who's around kids. And I think we all have some way of finding a relationship with kids. And just to like squander time with children and just like let that go and have those conversations and talk about the things you're struggling with and take their questions seriously and actually try to answer them and tell the truth and wander into the woods and see where they lead you. And I mean, I think I am so grateful that there are so many folks who can love on kids and in so many different ways. And I think that the folks who are listening to this who don't have kids have such valuable questions and learning and understand what it means to unlearn something and to see the gifts of imagination and community, and we all need that, and we all need that relationship with kids because kids are so hopeful and so joyful, and so the more intergenerational relationships we can have, the gift it will be to wherever our world is headed.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about the reorientation to the planet, but also I think for adults to reorient our relationship to children, right? If you're an adult, you at least at one point in your life were a child, and to
Mhm.
reorient our relationship back to that of, a lot of times we think of adults as, these people with way more knowledge. They have, they're sort of like these. Um, bastions of information and knowledge and wisdom, and we bestow that upon children. And yet, at the same time, anybody who has any sort of good relationship with the child knows that children are just as much, just as
Mhm.
wise, and have just as much
Oh.
interesting information, and can contribute so much to our lives as well. And so,
Mhm.
to make it this much more kind of two-way relationship rather than a one-way
Yeah.
relationship, I think that reorientation is so important, regardless if you're a parent or not.
Yeah. Allowing children to change us in this moment, I think, has unbelievable gifts that we can't even predict.
Absolutely. Last couple questions here, Lydia. How do you hope this book inspires and liberates its readers?
Mm. I hope it gives company that we're not alone and it gives freedom for honoring and releasing the grief and the rage that's in us. And yeah, that there is hope and beauty in the call that we're asked to move towards in this moment. Um, yeah, I just hope that we are liberated in that we understand ourselves as so completely part of this earth, and understand ourselves to be part of that great watershed community.
That's wonderful. Last question, Lydia. How can listeners get connected to you and your work?
Yeah. I mean, I would say go to G's Magazine, and we've only briefly touched on that, but it's a ad-free quarterly magazine at the intersection of art, activism, and spirit. And so, would love to have you there and connect that way. And then I'm also the director of Kirkridge Retreat Center in Eastern Pennsylvania, and so also looking at what are ways to create these spaces for liberation circles in retreats. And so would love to find you there at kirkridge.org and come visit and have these conversations together.
Love it. And where can people get the book, or where would you encourage people to get the book?
Yeah, I mean, ask your local bookstore would be wonderful. And certainly in all of the online places. Broadleaf is the publisher, so you can certainly find it there on their website as well.
Lovely, lovely. Well, thank you so much for chatting about this. Again, as somebody who I don't know if I'll ever have children, but as somebody who still absolutely loves children and thinking about future
Mhm.
generations when it comes to climate catastrophe, and also thinking about the rise of capitalism and where we're at in that world. I mean, just to think through all these things when it comes to children, I think is so so important. So, thank you so much for
Mhm.
writing about the book and chatting more about it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a great gift to be in conversation together.